too, but we'll get to that. So as a child, he was sickly, shy, frail. He was taken out of school quite often due to his illnesses, many of which were psychosomatic. But nonetheless, he was often bedbound for long periods of time. During these periods of time, he would be assailed by terrible nightmares, and many modern researchers believe he suffered from sleep paralysis. His dreams were filled with unspeakable and unearthly monsters whom he called the night gaunts, which he quite obviously derived inspiration from for his future stories, especially in his poem Night Gaunts and his novella The Dream Quest of Unknown Caitiff. He came from a wealthy, affluent family that lost their wealth after Lovecraft's beloved industrialist grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips, passed away of a stroke when Lovecraft was only a teenager. After that, his privileged and wealthy upbringing came to an end, and he lived with his mother and his aunts in a cramped small house that they split with another family. He became very close with his mother, Sarah Susie Phillips Lovecraft, and his misanthropic nature may have been derived from her. Notably, she referred to him as her grotesque son and encouraged him to remain indoors so that people would not be disturbed by him. Yeah, so she actually called him grotesque. I was like, you probably shouldn't go out there. Your face is hideous, and they're gonna be disturbed by you. She was also institutionalized in Butler Mental Hospital in 1919. Yes,
that's a funny follow-up.
right. Years later, Susie's psychiatrist wrote that he detected an edible complex in her relationship to her son. Ew. Yeah, they were that close. There was some.
That's what I was talking about the other day.
Yeah, there was some definite. I mean, I would not say that they actually were incestual, but there was definitely that sort of weird thing where he was living with her for way too long, and sort of a Norman Bates kind of thing started to develop.
He Christianed her.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Right. So, her being sent away to the institution sent Lovecraft spiraling into a deep depression that was worsened when she died from a botched gallbladder operation. He deeply mourned his mother, writing, "My mother was, in all probability, the only person who thoroughly understood me. I shall not again be likely to meet with a mind so thoroughly admirable." Although his mother's death was a tragedy for him, it also was the event that finally unglued him from her and allowed him to branch out on his own. He traveled throughout New England, writing journals about his travels, and eventually even got married for a short time anyways, and moved with the woman he married, Sonia Green, to a city that he hated more than anywhere else, New York. Although he was a vehement racist, he married a Jewish immigrant named Sonia Green, who traveled and worked as an amateur journalist and designer. She would send him money while she was away. Lovecraft, having grown up wealthy, was too proud to look for work, let alone actually take a job. So often he resorted to eating nothing but canned beans and coffee, a lifestyle which would eventually lead to his death in 1937 at the young age of 47 by cancer of the small intestine. So yeah, he was, a lot of people, when they talk about Lovecraft, they talk about how racist he was, and they bring that up. And, nowadays when people say that, it really kind of is like, okay, whatever. Lovecraft was really, really racist. He was like, even, it wasn't just like, oh, at that time, people thought like even for his day and age, he was like incredibly extreme in it. And so the fact that he married a Russian immigrant who was Jewish was pretty interesting. And like, what are you doing there? But he publicly stated that her marriage to him was her renouncing her Jewish heritage, which after he died, she said publicly, that was not true at all, dude. Like, I don't know what the hell he was talking about, but that's not true. He really thought that anybody who wasn't Anglo-Saxon and white were subhuman, were not actually people, they were animals. And there's no excuse for him for what he thought, but you can kind of understand where he was coming from, or why he thought that way, because he was raised in this sort of aristocratic, old English nobility sort of family.
Yeah, I imagine that a lot of that came from the fact that his grandfather was a Whipple Van Buren,
right.
whatever that was.
Well, and not only that, but then at that time period, all of these immigrants were coming into America. And, as a kid who grew up with 5 different types of forks at the table, then to be on the streets of New York City and to see these street merchants that, maybe they were dirty, they were speaking, different language. It wasn't the same sort of classy, fancy. So he saw them as beneath him, basically. And his old that old sort of way was going away. And
not to mention his mother, HP, don't go outside. The cold is a dirty man. It will get you. And this guy, didn't go outside and meet people, I guess.
Exactly. And he was misanthropic to begin with. He really despised people. So there was just so much vitriol and venom, and he used that and directed that, especially on anybody who wasn't his same white Anglo-Saxon. So although his work strongly evokes themes of occultism, paganism, and its ancient gods being real living beings, Lovecraft himself was a staunch atheist and a secular materialist and humanist, and was appalled by anything close to spirituality and to the spiritualism of his day. Okay, I already said about the soy facing. He fancied himself a nobleman, a man of reason who could appreciate the intellectual pursuits of science. And though being in good health and of strong, well-built stock, he was a hypochondriac who believed himself to be terribly ill most of the time and was a shut-in during many periods of his life. He would tell his friends of his terrible illnesses, and when talking to them, he would refer to himself as their old Uncle Lovecraft. So his friends would say, he looked strong. He looked tall and healthy, but he would always talk about how frail he was and how sickly he was. And I can't go outside. I'm terribly ill. Oh, come talk with your old Uncle Lovecraft. And they're like, dude, you're like 30. You're like 6'2". Like, what are you talking about? Right? Yeah. So, yeah.
Oh, shit.
His work is, however, a reflection of his misanthropy. They are not power fantasies, but oblivion fantasies and doom fantasies. The sort of reactionary tale of an incel or a mass shooter type. It's okay I wasn't invited to the party because I hate them all anyways. They don't even know how utterly meaningless their existence is. They don't even know that humanity will be wiped away and forgotten and everything they are means nothing. His work and his worldview not only justify his status as an antisocial loser, but also then position him as one of the rare few special boys that can see through it and can actually see what others cannot. A quote of his reads as follows: "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of a black sea of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the light into the peace and safety of a new dark age." Here you can see Lovecraft views himself as special, a seer. He sees what others do not, into the ultimate reality of the world and of human existence, and understands the place and meaning of both. That meaning, of course, is nothing, no point, no meaning at all, besides, of course, enjoyment of the here and now. Typical Reddit-level atheism and hedonism. Your marriages, your happy families, your friends, your lives mean nothing, and you can't even see it like me. His worldview and stories compensate for his lack of social ability, for his fear of other people. Lovecraft was known to venture out mostly at night in a dark coat with his collars up, hiding his face so that he appeared almost as a phantom or a shadow. When people walked by, he made sure not to make eye contact and to appear menacing and scary. He disliked most people and life itself. Clearly, he suffered from a sort of jealousy of what he saw of others' ignorance and lamented that he was born with such intelligence. However, that misanthropy had a limit and did not stop him from making and having some friends. Others he saw as intelligent as himself. Writers who shared the passion for the craft, people like Robert Bloch, Clark Ashton Smith, Frank Belknap Long Jr., August Derleth, and many others. He was reclusive and so carried on lengthy correspondences with them all over many, many years, writing over 10,000 letters, many of which are still around to this day. He ghost wrote a story for Harry Houdini and helped many young authors by editing their work and giving them advice. So that's mainly the notes I had. I already covered his death.
Wow, thank you, Jared. That was amazing. That was really informative. I got so much to say about that. Before we get to Nick, Green Feathers, just some things I'll point out that were new to me, and that you sort of illuminate, confirmed for me. One, that his letter writing. This guy was the prolific sort of proto Zoomer Boomer angry letter writer, and I read that he wrote. He was so prolific with his letter writing that he was like second only to Voltaire.
Right.
and I think there are a number of interesting themes that you sort of brought out there. One is that that was his family Methodist?
Gosh, I don't know. I don't know. I'd have to look that up.
I think they were Methodist, and I think it's interesting that like you said, he's part of this. He's part of this New England establishment, which sort of goes along with the literary establishment, and yet he was an outsider. I think that's it. Another thing is that he was a pulp writer. He was a pulp. He published in sort of pulp fiction and weird tales, and I think that ties into what later happened in the 20th century with a lot of writers. We've discussed this before, especially with like the Beat generation and the Beat writers publishing pulp fiction, especially like William Burroughs, originally published under a pseudonym, William Lee. It's where he published Junkie, and then it was a pulp novel, and then later published Naked Lunch under Maurice Gorodias, who was like a sort of a prawn. An early 20th century prawn romance pulp fiction publisher who published American writers who couldn't make it in America. And I think that another thing that's interesting is that this guy seems like the archetype of like you said, he's like the sallow skinned, sickly Norman Bates guy, Oedipal guy inside his house.
It's like the Columbine kid, like the dark goth, like incel.
Right. He is, yeah, and it's of course it's no surprise to me, his early death. I mean, and I read a bunch about how his family. I don't know, like you mentioned it, and I don't know if it's been brought out or if it's vindicated, but that there were rumors of INCES, and with the Whipple Van Buren and the sort of Rhode Island aristocracy and, all that, and then going destitute immediately afterwards and then living with his mom and all this stuff. It just seems like that contributed in a number of ways. Nick, what do you got, buddy? Tell us a little bit more.
So let me preface by saying Jerry is absolutely the expert between the three of us here in terms of Lovecraft's life, and I'd always been aware of his work. I was an English major in college. I just never really got into his work, actually until this spring of 2022, believe it or not. But I was so, I guess you could say, captivated by, like Jerry said, his combination of poetry and prose, similar to Shakespeare, but just fundamentally different in obviously the articulation, the style, and everything like that, his themes, but very, very palpable wording and stories themselves, so fascinating, especially so many of his stories for me personally, just like anecdotally, there's so many like odd kind of things that personally, like I'm into archaeology, and there's all these stories of people finding things and discovering things. Like the first story that I'll talk about, one of my favorite ones, it's called The Nameless City. So the main character, a lot of his narrators, oftentimes the stories are set in different time periods, but they kind of, I would say, at least based on what Jerry has pontificated so far about Lovecraft's life, sometimes his narrators are almost like different fragments of ways that he views the world. Not all the time, but there's times where he himself really shines out through his narrators.
Oh yeah.
And this particular time was kind of interesting in this story, The Nameless City. The narrator is a little bit skeptical, but he's curious enough to follow these ancient manuscripts of all these kind of demonic lore. One particular story that Lovecraft does a lot of, like, I guess you could say, lore linking in his stories, and he'll do that through these demonic manuscripts that a lot of main characters hear of or have reference to, or like a fragment of, and then another character in a story knows something else about. So this particular character, the narrator, The Nameless City, is traveling in Arabia in the desert, following like these ancient Bedouin tales and these ancient demoniac manuscripts, and comes across these gigantic, basically like Atlantean ruins from just like in Lovecraft's world in his mythos, it's so timeless that it's almost indescribable.
Right.
His time span is not really like, it doesn't link up with what we would consider to be accurate time. Like, for instance, his gods and his pantheons that came from space is supposed to be like hundreds of millions of years ago, like
Right.
and
Older
even
than the
beyond that,
mountains.
even billions. Yeah. So some of these basically pre-Diluvian civilizations play a big theme in a lot of his works, having to do with like Hollow Earth themes, esoteric lore, occult things like that, sort of like alternative history, things like that. So as this character is exploring these ruins, he's going deeper and deeper, and there's really unusual aspects to the architecture. Again, Lovecraft uses very poetic language in these. Like, you would really have to listen to the audiobook yourself. Really good channel to do so on is called the Exploring Series. Another one is called Horror Babble for Lovecraft's works. I don't really have the time to like sit down and read because my kids, so I do a lot of audiobooks right now while I'm doing other things, and those channels are great for that. So,
one thing, just to break in, Nick, one thing that you bring up about his themes that strikes me is that it seems like his sort of I don't know, his literary landscape and his cosmology kind of comes from, you can see that it arises from what he read as a child. I mean, I Jerry sort of explained this, and I read this in a biography that because Lovecraft was taken out of school when he was young, and he was a sickly child, but he had a big library at home, that I can see some of the origins. I mean, like you were talking about the desert, the story set in the desert, and I can see, the Arabian Nights and Sinbad in his stories. I can see that he sort of mixed his childhood reading in his library with this sort of, I don't know if this is going too far, but with the sort of horrors or the trauma that he was that was inflicted on him when he was young, with his father going into the mental hospital, with his mother being insane, mother, tell your children not to go outside. You're in Rhode Island with a Sam Hyde, and it's like, so he mixes his reading and his literary landscape with these sort of nameless, faceless creatures that I guess arose from the horrors of when he was young. Does that make any sense?